So we have Professor Graham Brown, who's you've all met before. We have Brooke, who you've met before as well, so talking about policy. And we have Sergeant Rhona Stace, who's a diversity liaison officer with the police force and brings all these other skills as well. And we have Dr. Simon Briggs, who's an infectious disease doctor who you've met before as well. So all these different perspectives, right? And we have you, who have all kinds of perspectives as well, right? So this is supposed to be a dialogue. Most of the stuff we've done on disclosure is old. It's before U equals U was really kind of a thing, right? U equals U has been around since like 2018, not mainstreamed until after that. So a lot of the research is from before that time. The new stuff is different, right? So what we're talking about is in the New Zealand context, I just want to give you a little bit of background, is disclosure, or is it sharing your HIV status, because disclosure is a little bit of a shitty term. So sharing your HIV status, and whether that's a legal obligation or a moral duty. So is kind of the concept I'm kind of leading with, and we're being more philosophical rather than hard-nosed here. In New Zealand, there's a legal obligation to disclose, right? And so we're kind of questioning that, because that's been around for a long time. Do you want to do your slides now, Brooke? Or yeah? So Brooke's going to give us a little bit of background on the legalese part of it. So the legal obligation versus the moral obligation. You're going to do the legal part.
Yes. Cool. So I just wanted to share this as a bit of background because in 2021, Burnett Foundation, then the New Zealand AIDS Foundation, commissioned advice from Bell Gully, who are some lawyers who support us, on what were people's obligations in regards to disclosure. And it's quite legal writing, so I felt weird like just speaking it, so I thought you can read it with me. And so, yeah, they said, you've asked us to provide advice on the legal obligations of people living with HIV in New Zealand when engaging in sex. So this is specific to sex, but of course we can talk about the variety of different contexts. In doing so, you've asked us to take into account the expert evidence that there is no possibility of transmission. Now we can say zero possibility of transmission. The use of PrEP and also antiretroviral therapies have increased the life expectancies of people living with HIV. I think part of that is around, the current general law under which HIV exposure and transmission is criminalised, talks about grievous bodily harm and acquiring HIV as grievous bodily harm. So that kind of speaks to some of that. At the time, our advice to people living with HIV engaging in sexual activity stated that there was no obligation to disclose one's status before engaging in anal or vaginal penetrative sex. Condoms should always be used. And while there is no legal obligation to disclose one's HIV status, PLHIV who disclose their status to their sexual partner before engaging in sex will avoid any criminal liability. So, just in case anyone does pull you up on it, you've got that defence. And so they advised us that the advice remained accurate. Condom use is sufficient to reduce the risk of HIV. There's a requirement under the law to take reasonable precaution, and the only defence that's been tested under the law is the use of condoms, and condoms are considered reasonable precautions. That's why the advice was to use condoms. Other forms of sexual activity, including oral sex, present such a negligible risk of transmission that no precautions to avoid HIV are required. Moreover, there are helpful judicial observations in New Zealand and strong authority internationally that disclosure and the obtaining of informed consent discharges any duty to take reasonable precautions. So they're saying, we have considered the evidence that antiretroviral treatment to reduce a person's viral load or taking of PrEP may negate or substantially reduce the risk of HIV. Given the evidence, has the same effect as wearing a condom, the use of such treatments should, in principle, also amount to reasonable precautions. However, in the absence of a test case in which a New Zealand court has concluded that these treatments amount to reasonable precautions, we would advise against broadening advice to community because there has been no precedent in the courts. So no person living with HIV has been put through the inherently traumatising process of having to defend their actions in court. And like, to be clear, I think we need to avoid that as much as possible. We don't want to address this in the courts. Second, although the Crown would bear the criminal burden of proof if it brought criminal charges, a person living with HIV defendant would bear an evidential burden of establishing that they either took or confirmed the taking of effective medical treatment, and they may face practical difficulties obtaining that evidence, including from their doctor and sexual partner, and suffer emotional distress. Finally, although there are strong arguments for accepting expert evidence as to the negligible risk of HIV transmission when treatment is taken, we can now say zero. Absent a test case, it is by no means certain that a court would accept this evidence. So that was only a couple of years ago, but the situation hasn't really changed. Thankfully, no one's been put through the courts, but do we need someone to have to go through that traumatising process in order for us to challenge the legal requirements? I hope not. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that's good. So that's the legal kind of situation, and historically New Zealand was ranked third highest in the world for the rate of HIV criminalisation. So that's with or without transmission of HIV, right? So that's from before, but like Brooke said, what's happened is those cases have dropped significantly. I don't think we've actually had cases go through at this point. So that's the good news. So the U equals U statement has got a lot stronger. So now we're confidently saying there is zero risk of transmission if you're undetectable, and lots of people are taking that on board. So, and that's where the question around reasonable, is taking medication so I'm undetectable a reasonable precaution for prevention of transmission, right? So therefore, the question is, should I have to disclose to everybody I meet when there is zero risk of transmission? And the laws, because they're general laws, they're not HIV-specific laws, are about preventing harm. And so there is no risk of harm. We know that. Everybody signed onto it. And so that's where the dilemma comes into it. And so I think, anybody want to comment, or are we good?
Yeah, I think we've landed squarely in my lane. Before we do progress, I'd just like to deal with the elephant in the room, and that is the way I've dressed today. I made a conscious decision. Normally I'm very cautious about the presence of the uniform, but today I came out of the closet like this. Which oddly enough is how I came out of the closet, and that's because while I'm aware that there's some history with us and the silver foxes in this room, not you, Mark, you're way too young to have been around back in the day, I think it's time things are changing, and things are changing. Just to give you a little, thank you very much. So I thought it was good for us to be visible in this discussion. Just to put a bit of background into it, I was very relieved at the timing of this, because I'm currently working with Positive Speakers on some training, first of all for our diversity liaison officers, but we're hoping to broaden that to the workforce around understanding HIV in the current environment. So, because the situation has changed greatly, and prior to my engaging in that conversation, I would have probably been at about the same level as the rest of my colleagues about where things are as far as HIV goes. And that brings me back to my lane. Sorry, I've broken my phone. There's a section in the training which deals with disclosure. And I was very glad to see that in the training, and it's going to stay in the training that we deliver. Essentially, it revolves, as has been pointed out, around this conversation in a legal context, and I should stress in a legal context, around reasonable precautions. Now, that's just advice, as has been pointed out. It hasn't been tested. So I think it's important to give a little perspective to that advice and a bit of reassurance around what that actually means. So I've heard it bandied around in some of the material that I had a look at that you sent me, Mark and Ron, wherever you are, and comments about it being against the law to have sex without a condom if you're HIV positive and those sorts of things. And this is a common, from my background as a prosecutor, and I have to stress, I can't give an official legal opinion on behalf of the police. I'm just giving you my perspective on this, given my experience as a prosecutor and in community safety education prior to that. But this comes down to essentially two main sections of the Crimes Act that would apply, Section 145 and Section 188. One is a public nuisance and the other is wounding with intent. And for a start, the whole question of reasonable precaution and the condom use, it's not in a statute anywhere. It's not the law. We're talking about case law precedent. And that's an important distinction to make. And it's in there, but I just think it's worth highlighting and understanding what that means. Furthermore, that was an obiter discussion. I can't remember whether it was in Pete and Y or the Delhi case, which are the two key cases, but it was an obiter. That means something that just happened to be said in passing during the conversation. And not only that, but it was a positive assertion as opposed to a negative one. So the comment was coming to the conclusion that if one were to wear a condom, that one would definitely have obviated that requirement to take reasonable precautions. Does that make sense? So I think that's very important to remember. And the other thing to remember is that we're talking in a legal context. So just to reassure you all, it's not illegal if you don't get caught. It might be strange advice coming from someone like me, but it's the way I get attention on the point that this is a conversation within a legal context and we're actually discussing this within a much wider social context. So there are we can't arrest our way out of everything. Can't arrest our way out of the drug problem, the needle use problem in Fiji. The key to this one is exactly what we're working on here, and that is educating and destigmatising and making sure that people understand what is really going on, that people are actually able to have open conversations about their conduct. It's my responsibility as a member of police to make sure the community can be safe and feel safe, and part of that responsibility is to equip and enable you as much as it is to equip and enable our people to do what you can to keep yourself safe, so you're not going to be in that situation where you're relying us, or indeed you've got caught and it's now a legal question. But coming down to the legal issue, I am very sceptical from my experience. This is very carefully worded legalese because lawyers don't like things they've written down to come back and bite them on the bum when they, odd chance they might be wrong. I would say from a practical point of view in court with some experience of the laws in question, long story short, it is very highly unlikely you would be prosecuted, let alone convicted, if you had taken the sorts of precautions that we've been talking about in this room here. If, on the other hand, you knowingly and willingly and deliberately went out to infect people with a disease, in other words, you weaponised your dick, I think everyone in this room would agree you should actually be responsible to the law, isn't that right? Yeah, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about people who are managing their illness responsibly, who are looking after their own health and who are looking after the health of other people. There's plenty of evidence, there's plenty of knowledge around. Undetectable is untransmissible. If you don't want to test the law, then by all means, use a condom, because there's case law precedent where an appeal court judge has said that would very definitely discharge that responsibility. Bear in mind that's there's a question about that reasonable precautions responsibility. That's not a legal responsibility either. They're talking about application of the common law to the situation. So it is very much a discussion around taking all the facts into consideration. Were reasonable precautions taken? And that's as much a medical and a evidential situation as it is a legal question. So I just thought I'd clarify that for you. I am going to stop now because we've only got 30 minutes.
So I think the issue is that if it gets to the court, it's gone a long way to get there. And the thing is, when it gets to the court, that's when they'll bring an expert witness in who will come in and talk about undetectable, and that's when it'll get deemed reasonable precaution. The whole issue of proving that you're undetectable at the time of the incident, like that kind of thing comes up. That's like the fear part of it. But we don't want it to get there, right? The pathway to get to that point where you actually end up in court is quite a traumatic pathway, even if it does get thrown out, right? Yeah. And anecdotally, like just in the last month, I've had a bunch of people coming to me. Usually it's ex-partners saying, I found out my ex was positive, they didn't tell me, what can I do to litigate them, pretty much. So there's some of that. We've had people, we've got things on Grindr where you can tell your status. People, if they put that they're undetectable positive on Grindr, everybody can see that, right? They can take a screenshot and they can use that against you, right? So who would actually tick that box to say I'm positive and deal with the hate and the crap that comes with it and the blocking? Most people are saying they're on PrEP because it's a biomedical prevention, it's kind of equivalent, but it's not saying you're undetectable, so it doesn't meet that ruling, right? And what happens is people go and they say, oh, he said he's on PrEP, but he's got this bottle of thing called dolutegravir in his cupboard. What does that mean? It's like, well, we know what that means. It means they're positive undetectable. So I think the space that we need to do a lot more work is in the education space, right? Like this kind of messaging. So and that's where I kind of come back to, so when I kind of phrased this originally was whether it's a legal obligation to disclose your status. So if you're having a hookup, a one-night stand, do you disclose your status there because it's a legal obligation? Is it a shared responsibility for the other person to ask the question if they're not using a condom, if they're not taking PrEP? Or is it a moral obligation, right? So
Two different things.
Two different things.
Oddly enough, you'd think they were the same, but they're not.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the question I kind of put to you around, not the legal piece is there and we need to fix it somehow. And we've struggled with that for a long time, and Brooke's doing some awesome work coming up soon to do some changes in that space. But in terms of the moral piece, I talked about this at work yesterday with some of the guys, and it got really heated around whether you should tell everybody that your status, like up front, or when do you decide? And I kind of pitched it as an idea of, it's like if I was a single parent and I had a 5-year-old at home, would I tell them on the first date that I had a 5-year-old? Would it go anywhere? Or do I wait until I think it's actually going to go somewhere? And then if I wait too long, have I now lied about my situation and the person's going to be shitty with me? But in terms of HIV, there's zero risk to them for me not disclosing. But in terms of, I've got a 5-year-old, there's no risk to them, but it's an obligation that changes the dynamic of the relationship. And so that's where the moral piece comes into it. But they could theoretically litigate in this situation because I didn't disclose and we didn't use a condom, even though there's zero risk. So that's kind of what I'm pitching to you guys in terms of your thoughts around that. Just like a discussion on, like, this is where we are. This is the legal situation we're in. This is the moral situation we're in terms of disclosure. Like, if we're in a perfect world, it would be like COVID, where I could take a photo of my HIV test and everybody would know and they would be supportive and it wouldn't be a big thing, right? But we're not in that world. We're in a world where there's potential harm that could be done if somebody knows my status. And so, comments?
I'm just reluctant of the white professor going first again.
I don't think it should be a legal obligation, but I would challenge whether it's a moral obligation as well, because if there's zero risk of transmission, what's immoral about it?
Yeah.
I also had a question of Rhona, but do you...
All I was going to say is, I suppose two things. One is, yeah, I agree, that the fact that there's a sense of there being an obligation of one sort or the other. I mean, there's others here who have researched and gone into stigma far more than I have, but all of the sort of policy evidence, research evidence shows that this situation undermines all the other strategies to reduce stigma. So even if you take it out of the particular situations, the fact that whatever the community thoughts are, regardless of what the truth is undermining all of those other strategies. So that alone. The other one I'd say is, if it got to the stage of having to be tested in court, my concern would be the impact that court case would have on stigma would actually be, if anything, to increase the stigma, not decrease it. So it's a lose-lose scenario.
I think it... Is this working? Oh, it is now. I certainly think it comes down to education, because actually the safest person to have sex with, if you're meeting someone for the first time, is someone who has HIV infection, is on treatment, has a suppressed viral load, because you can't catch HIV infection from them, but you certainly have got a chance of catching HIV infection from someone who either doesn't know they have HIV infection, or for some reason has HIV infection and they're not on treatment or haven't taken it well enough to have a suppressed viral load. So you're actually safest having sex with someone with HIV who's got a suppressed viral load, because it's not possible to catch HIV from them. So if that, and I guess that potentially that is quite a, it's quite a big thing to get out in terms of educating the general public about that, because it has to change a whole lot of thought processes and stigma that people have gathered over decades of their lives. But I think it's got to be that sort of education that then allows people to actually come to terms with that sort of, those sort of thoughts.
My issue with the education approach is that you're always going to come up against stigma and bias, and so it's going to be patchy. And I think the workforce education happening within the police and the DLOs is amazing, but I just wonder what you come up against. And we know from hearing from community that there's a range of different experiences when someone's partner's taken them to the police, and they are treated differently by different police. So my question is, to what extent can we put structures and guidelines in place so that some of the experiences are more standardised in terms of how it's treated?
That's education for the police, isn't it?
That's prosecution guidelines.
A guideline is an education sort of tool, isn't it? So it's...
Yeah. It's interesting you should mention prosecution guidelines, because we do have to operate under the Solicitor General's prosecution guidelines, and that makes it very clear we cannot commence or continue a prosecution unless we've both satisfied evidential sufficiency. So in that case, we'd have to have met all the evidential criteria, including intent and the public interest test. So my assessment of a situation like this is that in the investigation phase, if it came, and you have to bear in mind, it's highly unlikely this is going to come to us unless somebody is infected. Unless somebody has decided that they've discovered it and tries to bring it to us.
No, I've had during the last bit where usually it's an ex that's trying to get back at the person. And they say,
yes.
And then, so there's no transmission.
Yeah, no transmission, but they didn't disclose.
Didn't disclose, so it's non-consensual.
Right.
And so they go after him that way.
Yeah, of course. So the two issues there that would be germane to that argument, one would have to actually ascertain legally whether or not it fit a particular criminal offence. So that's one aspect of evidential sufficiency, is whether or not what is done is meet the ingredients of the offence. And one of those ingredients inevitably is intent. In the case of public nuisance, there's no intent component except for that requirement to have taken reasonable precautions to mitigate the risk. In the case of wounding with intent, under section 118, your intent comes down to either a specific deliberate intent to infect that person, or at the lower form of the offence you'd be looking at reckless disregard, which is where the argument comes in about that's what the argument about using a condom or not using a condom when you're aware that you're HIV positive goes. My gut feeling is that in the absence of transmission, that's actually already in your favour. That transmission didn't occur in that conversation. When it comes to the investigation stage and the decision whether or not to file charges in the first place, because you'd have to meet that requirement under the Solicitor General's prosecution guidelines. But Mark, are you telling me someone has actually had a prosecution filed against them?
They're under investigation.
Right, yeah. So now that's traumatic enough.
Yeah.
That's traumatic enough.
And the problem with that is that they come and they take your devices, you work from home, so your device is gone, you've got a partner. And I think the big issue for us is that a lot of these complaints initiate from within the gay community. So we're talking about educating our community to not go and try and litigate their partners for being undetectable, right?
Yeah.
But that's what's happening. And so one of the examples is two people were on PrEP, or one person was on PrEP, the positive person wasn't on PrEP but said he was because it was easier. And then the other partner says, well, I'm going to stop taking my PrEP now because we're in a monogamous relationship. And that's when he said, well, actually, I need to tell you something. I'm positive undetectable. And that's when the other person got shitty.
Right. So this is really the nub of that problem.
Yeah.
Because in a situation like that, so we might as well deal with that situation, because the other end of the situation where someone's deliberately going around infecting people is fairly straightforward and obvious. So this is the one that's probably of the most concern to people.
Yeah.
Is that if a credible complainant comes forward and is prepared to sign a statement of complaint for whatever reason, of conduct that meets the ingredients of a potential criminal offence, we're obliged to investigate whether that's to prove or disprove. So there's not a lot that a change in law or prosecution guidelines or anything like that would actually do to assist in that case, because we have to assume that what they've said in the first place amounts to the ingredients of either one of those two offences that we're talking about, or some other criminal offence at law. So the problem there is the willingness of certain individuals to come to police and sign a sworn statement claiming that a person has done those things.
Yeah.
There is still, however, that's something we can't do anything about, but there are things we can do something about. And one of them is to increase the awareness of our workforce and our investigators around the reality of the current situation with HIV, and if not, have them all being experts in the current situation with undetectable equals untransmissible, etc., to at least make sure that they know that there are people around who do know more about that sort of thing to go and talk to when they have a case like that. And that is what we're encouraging them to do increasingly these days, bearing in mind we've been working full-time on improving that for only 2 years now, but we're making a lot of headway. So in that situation, there's really no way potentially to avoid being investigated if somebody, whether genuinely or for malicious intent, is prepared to come to the police and sign a statement that you've done this conduct that potentially amounts to criminal behaviour. It's a whole other thing for that investigation to then get to the stage of a prosecution being filed, which is where prosecution guidelines would become relevant. And it's a whole other thing again for that to get to the state of potential for conviction. Be that as it may, every stage of that process is just as another stage of potential trauma. We can't really do a lot about being investigated in the first instance if someone's prepared to make that allegation. But we can potentially improve the speed with which we actually answer those questions and bring that to conclusion by increasing the awareness within our investigative workforce about the reality of this type of case. I have to say that for the majority of the population, and this therefore applies to the majority of our police population, this is not an issue they know a lot about, because it's not an issue they have ever had to know anything about, because it doesn't form part of their life issues. But that's where education comes in, and getting the message across to other people why it's important to understand that they live in a diverse society, that people within the society they live in have different needs, and it's important to understand the needs of different people that may be different to your needs. And that's a much, much bigger question that we just have a small part of to deal with.
So just in mindfulness of time, because I'm running over again, just want to have a couple of closing comments from you guys. Do you have anything you want to finish off with?
I was going to say, you know, aren't relationships easy? I suppose what it is, like, the scenario is, from a community response angle, the scenario is someone that's feeling, like in that scenario, and we don't know them, but like as a hypothetical scenario, who are feeling hurt, angry and frustrated, aren't going to make great decisions. What I'm thinking about is what, at a community response, can we do so that the people around that really angry person can actually try and steer them before they get to making the complaint, and then tapping into, like you're saying, what are things we can do at that complaint process that can help steer that person to something that's going to be a lot more effective in resolving that whole scenario. But I just think there's a strong community response aspect there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky because I think, you know, every week Mark or I probably have to provide support to someone in community, either someone living with HIV whose partner's taken them to the police, or someone not living with HIV who, you know, has just found out that one of their exes was, and how they're treated seems to vary greatly. Sometimes, you know, it's a really supportive experience and the case just gets thrown out, which is probably why we haven't had another precedent, and that's amazing. But there's always that fear, I think, hovering for people living with HIV, and we need to figure out a way that we can standardise care among the police so that we don't have to go through case law, and we can keep getting cases thrown out. So, yeah.
Oh, it sounded like a good segue to me again. Thanks, Brooke. You just keep feeding them to me. Two things. One is in terms of the fear around engaging with police. I'd like to acknowledge that there's a reason for that. Lack of trust and confidence in us. There's a historical relationship there that has yet to be repaired and that we are working on repairing. I can't speak on behalf of the Commissioner of Police, but personally, to those of you who are affected by the way we policed certain laws back in the day, and even after the homosexual law reform bill was passed, I would like to say I'm sorry we did that to you. I apologise for that wholeheartedly. And who knows, one day we may get someone in a position of greater authority to me to make that apology formal. Certainly, if Sharon and I have anything to do with it, it's a question of when, not if. So that's a commitment to work to improve the situation as far as the police's role in this goes. The other one is that I think overall we've covered it well. I think the real answer to this whole situation is to improve awareness and reduce stigma. We're just planning a HIV myth-busting day at Police National Headquarters, which will be live streamed. We're going to have Kit Harding from positive speakers and some people from Burnett Foundation come and pack condoms and talk about the reality of HIV in this age. And that will also give us the opportunity to promote the training we're putting out to DLOs and allow us to start a conversation about that training going to our wider workforce. And I think at the end of the day, the law is an ass. The solution lies in the things that you guys have been discussing here today. Thank you very much.
I don't have any magic answers, but I will say that if it ever got to a stage where it went to court, and one would hope that it doesn't get to that stage, but there would be plenty of clinicians who would be happy to sit there in the evidence box and say, U equals U, there's no risk of transmission. So, and then presumably the judge would take that message on board and find in the correct way. And the last time that I was directly involved in a situation where a prosecution was about to take place, I spoke to the Crown Prosecutor and told her that and said that, if you take this to court, I'll be sitting in the box giving you this scientific information, or giving the judge this scientific information. And at that stage, she decided that she wasn't going to take the case any further. So I guess that's all, I can say from that point of view. I think it is reasonable for people, the vast majority of the community out there, who are taking their medications every day and have a suppressed viral load. I think it is sensible to have a reasonably regular viral load test, because that way you can, if you ever got in a situation where you needed to, you could say, here's my last viral load test result, it's undetectable. Here are my last 6 test results, they're all undetectable. That shows that I have a pattern of good behaviour, I'm not putting anybody at risk. Thank you very much. So I think that that's also a good thing to be able to have in your back pocket. Yeah.
Basically, take good care of your own health and make sure you care about other people's health, and it should be fine.
Okay, thank you.